Not sure if we'll need the microphone, but maybe it would be good to have it on for John and just to get a good sound on the recording as well. We'll shut off some lights here in a minute. Thank you for coming. Mount Olive's 100th anniversary year, and we're having a number of different events. And this, of course, is kind of a follow-up. We had a history presenter a few months ago talking about what Duluth was like as a whole 100 years ago. And now what we're doing is looking at the history of Mount Olive, this congregation, and how this congregation what this congregation has gone through in the last 100 years from its founding to this day. And our speaker will be Jon Farchmin, presenting a lot of pictures and a lot of information. Taking questions as we go as well, and many of you are familiar with some of the history things here too, and probably make it a little bit of an interactive. Let's have a prayer as we give thanks to God for what He has provided for us. Lord God, Heavenly Father, You do care for Your church, providing many streams of blessings that provide for Your people and flow through Your people to care and minister to those around them. We pray that You would bless this evening as we remember Your provision and Your protection, and remember how You do care for us, and anticipate how You will work through us going into the future. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. John?
Well, welcome. And
You gotta put it right up to you to get the sound.
okay.
Otherwise, speak loud.
I guess I'd rather speak loud if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. If you can't hear me, let me know. Is it gonna be okay?
Got a little louder.
Okay, here we go. Okay, welcome, and the presentation for 100 years of Mount
Is the
Olive.
microphone on?
Yeah, you gotta speak right into it.
Closer.
Yeah.
Right there.
Okay.
We
So,
love you.
that's already begun. So, I'm going to break the 100 years into 4 different sections. The first one is going to be from 1894 to 1921, and that's going to be briefly talking about St. Stephen's German Evangelical Lutheran Church. They were in the West End, and they are actually our parent congregation. We were a mission church of theirs in 1921. Then I will go and shift gears, go back to 1888 or 1881 to 1906, but talk about this property before Trinity Cathedral built the church. Then I'll jump back up to 4th Street where we built our original church, and that'll be the period 1922 to 1956, and then 1956 to the present will be the 4th section. So we will start in West Duluth. This is St. Stephen's Church, and they were incorporated in 1891 as a congregation, and it took them 3 years to be able to build this church. And the church was at I guess I didn't write it down here, but anyway, it was in West Duluth on Raleigh Street. Oh, there it is, right there, okay. So, and this was their home until 1915. And at that time then, they built a larger church at 30th Avenue North and 58th. And that church is still standing. I'll have a picture of it. And then in 1916, they sold this church to Good Shepherd Roman Catholic Parish for $200. And then in 1919, the Catholic Church rolled the church 8 blocks down Raleigh Street on white pine logs to its new location. And this is what their church looked like after putting in a couple additions in 1950. And unfortunately, they tore the church down in 1959. This is our first pastor, and from the moment that St. Stephen's was incorporated as a church, they had multiple pastors, and they wanted to get a presence in East Duluth. A lot of the other churches were already here, mostly clustered around our downtown area. The Danish Norwegians were here, the Finnish were here, and also the Germans and Swedes. And again, they were all around the downtown area. And then finally, on May 2nd, 1921, Pastor Walter Sievers, who was the main pastor of St. Stephen's, met with August Lutke in his home, and this was the very beginning then of St. Stephen's finally having a presence on the east end of Duluth. And August Lutke's home, where they met to start the beginning of Mount Olive, if you remember the Plaza Shopping Center, it's Walgreens right now. That's where his house was. And if you go back to the Plaza Shopping Center where the Hallmark store was, that's the lot that his house was on.
CVS.
No.
No, it's Walgreens.
Yeah, there was another Walgreens.
Yeah. So,
So John, they were two separate congregations. St. Stephen's remained
right,
where St. Stephen's was,
right,
and then Mount Olive became a new congregation?
right. This is actually the new church that St. Stephen's built in 1916. And while we were building our church, and I'll get into that a little later, there was a delay because of weather. And so there was a year where Mount Olive congregation were meeting in this church. The first year that we were, so from 1921 to 1922, this was where we met. And then I wish that Jerry and Kathy Haas were here, because they know the history of St. Stephen's. And it's my understanding that Christ the King is where St. Stephen's went, because they sold this building in 1961, and after that I couldn't follow where they were until I talked to Kathy and Jerry Haas, and they said it was Christ the King is where St. Stephen's congregation went.
St. Stephen's formed a congregation that was at the location where St. Christ the King was, and kind of an outreach, another
Okay.
outreach. And then later, the two congregations merged and built a new building at
Got
Christ the King.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, the information I had from this just said that they left, and I couldn't follow it. Okay, now I'll come to this location here, and then and I'll be going back to 1881, and that's when the Duluth Street Railway Company was formed. And they began service in 1883 with cars like this pulling mules for a nickel a fare. And as the lines grew, the mules were replaced by horses and extended east down Superior Street to 22nd Avenue East. And then because of their expansion, they built a horse barn on this property somewhere in the early to mid 1880s.
Yep.
You mean right here?
Right here. I'll have a plat of it. So this is the Streetcar Barn, and on the right-hand side is 20th Avenue East, and in front is Superior Street. And their offices, and this will come into play later, is on the right-hand side, and then the barn is on the left, kind of toward where our church is standing now. In 1901, Bishop Morrison of the Episcopal Church organized a congregation in East Duluth, and until a church could be built, he contacted the streetcar company because this building was abandoned, and received permission to use the abandoned barn for the congregation. The Sunday schools were held in the offices, and then periodically they would have church services in the barn area. And Carol Walczak found this plat map from 1902, and right there is the car barn. And so they owned the 2 lots the car barn was on, plus this lot, and then the 3 lots right behind. So, and this is an interesting deal. It kind of shows what Duluth was like in 1906. First, look at how little housing there is in the area. And then the main east-west roads, this is London Road, and this is 2nd. And that was what they called macadam. And it's either concrete or cement mixed in with gravel. So it's their best travel roads. The main route up the hill was of this macadam, but it wasn't 21st. It was over here on 16th. This is crushed limestone. The yellow is crushed limestone. And then the gray going in front of the car barn or our future church, that is what they called cedar block. So I'm assuming they were just squares of cedar and made into a pavement.
John, what year is this again that you're talking about?
1902. Yeah, and thank you, Carol, for finding that. Well, I know she's here. Yeah, thank you for finding that. I grabbed this for several reasons. This is the Crosby Home, and it's at the corner of 21st and Superior Street. And if you look, the street itself is dirt, and in doing some research, I found out that the dirt, or Superior Street was repaved to that macadam in 1904. So this picture is probably just prior to that resurfacing in 1904. So that's 2 years before our church was built. And if you look over at the light pole on the right, you see a block along the street. Kind of gives you a sense of how people were traveling. Do anybody know why that block is there? It's to help step out of your horse-drawn carriage. So most of the houses of this period had those. So this house was built in 1902.
They found that.
They found that.
Put it up there by the sidewalk.
Okay. Is it there now?
Yes.
Oh, I'll have to take a look.
They found that buried someplace in the backyard. And
Okay.
They dug it out and figured out what it was.
Super, okay. I'll have to look and see it. So George Crosby, he is the same George Crosby that opened up the Mesaba and Kiona Range. He was also very involved with opening up of the Atlantic Seaway, because he was involved with that up through the 1940s. And the reason I mentioned George Crosby is he was a member, early member of Trinity Cathedral. So he had the house right across the street. And I'm thinking this picture is probably taken since they were having church services in the Streetcar Barn. This is from the Streetcar Barn. So kind of an interesting thing. And then the third thing, of the reason I'm showing this, is that his house was made out of Flag River brownstone. And that is also the same stone that our church is made from. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that George Crosby was the one that suggested to build it with this stone. And they do, one of the windows up in this side by the organ is from the Crosby family.
There's actually 3 of them from Crosby.
All 3? Okay.
There are 3.
3 of the 4 early ones. Okay, thank you. So this is a picture of the Cornerstone Lane of our church, Mount Olive. The demolition of the horse car barn began in August of 1906, and the lane of this cornerstone was in September of 29, 1906. And if you look in the bottom right, it's maybe hard to see, but there's a lot of rubble. I'm assuming that that's from the demolition of the streetcar barn. And I'm still thinking this is also maybe from parts of the streetcar barn that was not torn down yet. And that's where they got this picture from. They did the construction through the winter.
Still is.
And on May 26, 1907, the church was dedicated. Oh, and I want to go back. I want to point out, look how close the house is next door on the left. And that'll come into play a little bit later. So we come back now to Pastor Sievers, and he was our main pastor for a year, as well as the main pastor of St. Stephen's. And that fall, a church building site was purchased, and this would be in 1921 at 19th Avenue East and 4th Street, and it was bought for $3,231. And they had hoped that the construction could be completed by February 1, but that was a harsh winter. And if any of you are getting the paper and you read the bygone days, there's been 2 mentions. I'll read them. February 26th of 1922, this was a couple weeks ago in our paper, in Bygones, all means of transportation between Morgan Park, Fond du Lac, and Oliver cut off owing to snowdrifts from the blizzard earlier this week, some 20 feet high, still blocking the highways. And then a week later, on March 5th, 1922, the snowstorm which halted traffic in Superior last week cost the city $15,000. About 1,000 shovelers were employed for 3 days after the storm, and 15 teams and trucks were used to haul the snow away. And I'm assuming the 15 teams are referring to horses and wagons. So they were still in 1922 using horses and wagons. So therefore the construction didn't start until the spring of 1922. And even though they ran into a lot of rock, things moved quickly. And then one bright spot of all the rock that they ran into is that they incorporated that into the construction. And as Julie says in her book, the hymn, "Built on a Rock, the Church Does Stand," became a favorite of the newly formed church. So this is the laying of the cornerstone, and this also then begins a little bit of a mystery. Many of you probably remember Dick Gassler, and multiple times he came to me and said, "John, we got to get up to 4th Street because there's a time capsule in the Cornerstone." And so that's been kept in the back of my mind. And so I've looked through paperwork. I know Julie has looked through paperwork. We can't find anything to verify that, but we'll keep looking. And if there is a time capsule up there, we'll see if we can get it. But as of right now, except for what Dick says, we haven't found any other verification. So stay tuned on that. So this is the completed church, and Pastor Sievers' tenure as pastor lasted only 1 year. He left in November of 1922, and then his associate pastor of St. Stephen's, Edgar Kirsch, ended up serving both congregations, ours and also his. And then Pastor Kirsch was also, as an associate pastor, helping the churches in Munger and Grand. So when Pastor Kirsch became our pastor, he was serving 4 congregations. And then I also want to point out where this white line is. That's kind of the railing of the outdoor entrance. And that will be a motivation of enclosing that 25 years later. And I'll have some pictures of the enclosed. And because one of the records that Julie had found is that our first couple of years, we only had services every other week. And I'm pretty sure that's the reason, is because Pastor Kirsch was covering so many congregations. So here's some of the things that have happened during Pastor Kirsch's tenure, and I'll cover 3 of those. The first is that in 1927, the congregation built for Pastor Kirsch a parsonage which was behind the new church. And the second was that he had in his congregation Edgar C. Felton. And I don't know if any of you know of him or
yeah.
heard
Oh,
of
yeah.
him. Okay.
He is.
He was good.
Yeah, Kathy Haas says the same thing. So he was definitely a major influence in our congregation. Pastor Kurz realized he was a music teacher in the community and could play the organ. He also led all the choirs, really developed a music program at the new church. And he was instrumental in buying this pipe organ. And it was, unfortunately, it was bought used, and so it didn't last the length of the time that we were up at that church, and they ended up having to buy an electric one several years later. And then the third highlight of Pastor Kirsch is kind of a sad one. He was on vacation outside of Superior in August of 1940, and he had a heart attack. And they rushed him into Duluth and took him to the hospital. Unfortunately, he passed away that night in the hospital. So his tenure ended abruptly. And then Pastor Gallman became our next pastor. He was our third pastor, and he served for 7 years, many of those through World War II. And we have a couple of the newsletter year-end reports from 42 and 43, and it was interesting that there was much mention of all the veterans. There were 37 Mount Olive men that served during World War II, and they did a good job of commemorating those men. They all survived, and just to let you know, if you don't, that we to this day still commemorate our veterans, and we have a veterans memorial up in the upper room. So if you haven't looked at that for a while, take a look at it.
One more thing back to Pastor Kirsch.
Yeah.
So Julie Ballmer, now Lindgren, was her first husband was, buried there, Michael, buried in Forest Hill Cemetery.
Okay.
She was walking around the cemetery and, just noticed this beautiful tombstone, and she went over there and it said it was Pastor Kirsch,
Oh.
pastor of Mount Olive Lutheran Church, buried up there. So.
And which cemetery?
Forest Hill.
Forest Hill.
A nice cross, and she just was impressed with how, just bore great witness to Jesus Christ, and
Yeah.
went over there and was surprised to see it was the pastor of this church.
Yeah, I'll have to go up there and take a look. I love going through cemeteries, so, yeah. And what Pastor Frank just did, do that, because as you can tell, I'm reading my notes. There's a lot of material here, and I'd love to get stories in like that into the presentation. This is the Remodel Church, and I pointed out that white line. You can see it, the white line a partial way, but it doesn't follow where the stairs are because that now is enclosed. And so they had a major remodel in 1947, and that was initiated because after the war, materials finally became available. And so they remodeled the altar, redesigned the chancel, and with a docile curtain, and also enclosed the entrance, and that was the main reason for doing that.
Where was that taken from? Across 4th Street?
No, that's on
No,
Across the avenue.
Yeah,
Across
20,
19.
Across 19?
Yeah.
Across 19. Yeah.
right. 4th Street would be off to the right.
It seems like it's going the wrong way. Which side of the street was it on? Must have been on the east side.
East side.
Yep.
It's on the east. You
Yeah.
can see
East side,
you
yeah.
see that church up there.
Yeah, it's
On the
on the
northeast
upper
corner.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
That door now is the door to go into the coffee shop, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Tim, I'm going to bring this up a little later, but have you had any luck getting into contact for us to do a
Yes.
tour?
Yes, I found out that they had called me back, and it never showed up on my phone until 2 days after I spoke to her, that she had called me 2 weeks prior. One of those late messages. There is a husband and wife team now that are both ministers of the church. And she runs the office and called me back and said they would love to have us come up and do a tour, and they would facilitate it. Told her we'd be looking at a Saturday, and she said, Sundays are out, and I said, well, they are for us too. And she laughed and said, I figured as much. And I said, no, we'd be looking at a Saturday so that everybody could, most everybody could come. And we were looking in, head down, it's May we were looking at doing that, right?
Yeah, May.
Told her in May, and she said, just let us know when. And I think I do need to call her back, but I think we kind of settled on May 19th. And they said that they would accommodate us, and she said, she asked a couple of, some of the things we were doing, and when I said we were going to do tours of this building, she said to let her know, because it would be neat to see, because now that this is part of their history there, see where we came to, and would like to come over and do the official tour,
Super.
so.
Okay, great.
Is that opening fishing?
What?
Seems late.
I don't think the 19th is a Saturday.
Mother's Day weekend?
When's Mother's Day?
Probably the weekend before is probably Mother's Day.
I think I think the Mother's Day is like the 9th or something.
Oh, okay. That's probably when fishing season opens.
May 21st. 21st is the Saturday.
21st?
Yep.
Okay, so I think it's the week, is it the week before
Yeah.
that's Mother's Day?
Right, yep.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks, Tim, for coordinating that. So this is the 1947 booklet. This was our first quarter century celebration that we were a church for 25 years. And there was also, in 1947, is when Pastor Gallman left, but before he left, a daughter church in Lakeside was formed called St. Luke's. And this I hadn't learned until I had read this. And Pastor, do you know what happened to St. Luke's?
St. Luke's, so there was a small congregation in Lakeside. There was also an ALC parish in Lakeside. It was a small mission parish, and they merged at the time that we were in fellowship and became, what was it, Grace Lutheran?
I think that's what Jerry and Kathy said.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And then when we left fellowship with ALC, eventually they had to decide one or the other and went ALC.
Okay. So anyway, that was our first mission effort to start a church, 25 years after St. Stephen started us. So I thought that was pretty quick. So this is the inside of the church, and I'm pretty sure it's the Remodel church. I think that organ on the left, that's the electric organ. So the pipe organ was gone by this time.
What year was this again?
It'd be after their remodel of 1947. So sometime after 1947.
So Mom and Dad were married in the church before the remodel.
Oh,
They
okay.
were married in 45.
Okay. Did they talk about a good organ or a tough organ? So,
I can't ask them.
yeah.
But we do have pictures, their wedding pictures were standing right before the altar.
Okay, neat. So it'd be interesting to see those with regards to being before this remodel. To have that as a record, if we could get a copy of that,
sure.
that would be great.
Is that the same pulpit as we have
Yes.
today? And they moved it?
Yes, they brought it
Looks like
down.
it is, yeah.
Is that right?
Ah,
All three of them
Lectern
got
looks the
brought
same
down
too.
here. And the altar then?
Good catch.
The altar looks the same too, yeah. I
Yeah,
think.
all three got brought down here.
very neat. Very neat. So, Pastor Brose is our next pastor. He was only here for 1 year. He left because of some health reasons. But one of the claims for fame during this period is that he put our services on KDAL radio. And the choir sang for that also. So
I always say he spent one winter in Duluth.
one winter. And where did they go? California. So then the next pastor is Pastor Bowman. He was here for 6 years. He was very fluent in German. And so this was shortly after. Yeah, right.
I know him well.
Oh, did you? Super. And
He had Silver Bay later on too.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
He had also the congregation later on in Silver Bay.
Okay, okay.
It's up there.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there were a lot of Germans that were moving into the area, and they asked him, since he was very fluent in German, if he would do some services. And so he did 2 services for the new immigrants coming from the war. And then he also spearheaded mission churches in both Two Harbors and Silver Bay. So during his tenure, then our 2nd and 3rd mission churches came out of Mount Olive. And then he was the one that began negotiations with our current church, Trinity Episcopal Church. And unfortunately, he did not see the completion of the purchase, but he got it started. So this is the River Church today. And I guess as Tim said, the red door that we saw in our original one, I guess is going into a coffee shop. So, and I think if you look just to the left of the sign, there's a white block. I think that's the Cornerstone. If I went back to the Cornerstone lane, it was at that level that they were working on. So I think that white block is the Cornerstone.
John,
Yeah.
did you say there's a coffee shop, a commercial coffee shop in there?
Is that what it is,
It
Tim?
was a church,
Huh?
a church-based coffee shop.
Church-based?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's just for the people who belong to the congregation, or can people
I
go in there
think
and buy coffee?
anybody can go
Can I
in
go
there.
in there and buy coffee and
It's only open during
donuts?
services though.
Is it?
Okay.
There's activities at the church.
Okay,
Just
okay.
the church?
So it's similar to the one up in Kenwood, that church up there.
Okay, our next pastor is Gerhard Rouge. He was our 6th pastor, and he came in August 14th, 1955, and he did not have much of a honeymoon period. For his first 3 months, we're focused on purchasing Trinity Cathedral here. And they bought it for $75,000, and then as soon as they closed the sale, major remodeling occurred. They put on a new roof, so apparently the former congregation, they were having financial problems, so we had a lot of repair. Restoring plaster in the nave and chancel, repainting the interior, installing oak paneling in the chancel area, and then a 20 by 10 foot red dossal was hung behind the altar, and we just, in our cleaning this winter, we found that. And so that's here somewhere. I'm not sure where it is now. And then there was an 8-foot wooden cross suspended in the center of the dossal. So this is the property that we bought. So it'd be, these are the 2 lots that the car barn was on. And then our church was built here. And then we own, I think when we bought the property, we only own the front half of these 3. We did not own down in here. And that's going to come into play.
So those were purchased in entirety, I think.
Were they?
Yeah.
Not this house, where this
Well,
house
no,
is.
the over those 2.
These 2, okay, so, but wasn't Wendling's house right in
No,
here?
their Wednesday's house is further down. It's like that 3.
Oh, okay, okay.
And yeah, so we own and we still own the property all the way down, and in fact into that street, which is platted there, but there's no street there.
Oh, that's where I'm
When the-
confused. Okay.
The Wendlings went, kind of instituted the purchase of that street, and they took half and gave half to Mount Olive, or we bought it. But,
Got it. Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
yeah.
And as you can see, when we bought the property, how close the house was to the church. So, and this is going to come into play in about 20 years. I'll get to that.
Hopefully tonight.
Yeah.
Some of us won't be here to hear it.
So here's the march from our old church up in 4th Street down here. And I'm glad the Stevensons are here because I think Jeff is probably in this picture.
It's that little white one on the corner.
Way to the right.
And then also Pat Johnson and her mother, Vi Miller, is in this picture somewhere. So they're, I think, the only two members left that probably made this walk down.
56?
Yeah. Yep. And I'll just kind of describe what was going on. There was a brief farewell service up at the old church by Pastor Rush. And he then led the officers carrying the sacred book and vessels, followed by the congregation down to our current church. And then on the front steps, there was a service of the church portal. And then inside, the officers presented Rush with the sacred book and vessels, and then there was a service of dedication that followed. And then sometime during Rush's tenure, and then step back, I think when we do the tour, we should reproduce this walk down the hill. I think that would be interesting to do, so I think we should do that. And then sometime during Rush's tenure, the pipe organ that was purchased when we bought Trinity was refurbished by Norbert Bersdorf, who was an immigrant, a German immigrant, who came to the U.S. in 1949. His family was from a long tenure of organ builders, but their business was destroyed by the war in 1945 in Germany, and he spent several years in Russian prison camps before he immigrated with his wife here. I thought that was an interesting story. He guaranteed his work for 100 years, and unfortunately it didn't last for 20, not anything he did. Okay, so here's Pastor Reineman. Most of us remember him. He was our longest pastor of 32 years, and his son Jeff is still a member here. And a lot happened, and I'll just cover a few during his tenure. First was in 1956. The congregation bought 6 stained glass windows of 6 more of the apostles. And then these complemented the 4 that were already here. So this gave us 10 of the 12 apostles in our stained glass windows. And if you look upstairs, there's a special plaque on this wall. Yeah, this wall. Am I right? Yeah.
Yep.
And commemorating those 6 families that donated those stained glass windows. And in 1968, just 12 years after purchasing our church, the original mortgage of $72,500 was burned. And anybody recognize that handsome young man in the middle catching the ashes? Ernst Schoenfeld.
I'd like to answer the part.
That was a while ago.
Yeah.
So this is the church, close to when we bought it and before our next remodel in 1956. And again, just look how close that house was. We had no parking back then. Everybody that came to the church had to park in the street. And so an opportunity came up, and we were able to buy that house in 1971 for $10,000. And we tore it down, and that was our first parking lot. So in 1970, there was a major construction project that was undertaken for $112,000. And I want to emphasize, and most of us here know that, in fact, let me go back. This is the front of the church coming in, so we came in through those two doorways, and the altar was in the very back of the church, which is just 180 degrees different from what we are now. So this is what it looked like this is now the back of the church, our back of the church. And so the remodel was done. The kitchen and fellowship hall down here, the kitchen was up in the front of the church. They brought it back to the back of the church. So the fellowship halls were just flipped during that construction. New plumbing, heating, electrical system was set up in the sub-basement, a new narthex. And then they renovated the washrooms in 1970. These are the washrooms that we just remodeled in 2020.
All those were 70s era bathrooms.
Right, yeah.
They were redone, what, in 1970?
1970.
So
When I talk about the next edition, I'll explain why those
I
stayed.
just find it interesting, because didn't we redo them, did we do them in 2020 or
Yes.
2021? So we did them exactly 50 years later.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it was 2020. Another thing that happened in 1970 is that the windows that are on this end of the church were deteriorating, and instead of taking the windows out, they just bricked up the outside, sheetrocked the inside, and if you drive behind the church, you can still see where those three windows were. The other thing that happened during that construction was the building of our brownstone message sign. And that came from the Methodist church that was torn down to make room in 1969 for St. Mary's parking lot. So we were able to get that brownstone. And it was just a stonemason from Proctor that thought it'd be fun to work on a project like that. And Pastor Reinman's comment was, we didn't pay him enough. And then that tapestry and cross that I talked about, that is what was being described on that. So, with all the new changes that they were doing, they were hoping to joyously celebrate a 50-year anniversary on May 2nd, 1971, but if you look, the 50-year anniversary didn't happen until October 24th, 1971, and that's because we had a fire. And on April 16th, fire broke out in the sub-basement. It was put out within 20 minutes, and the fireman said that if it had gone on for another 5 minutes, the entire church would have burned. Sub-basement had the worst damage. All the new utilities were destroyed. Heavy smoke through the church. Fireside room, which is today's library, that was nearly burned through. Unfortunately, putting the kitchen back here also destroyed the new kitchen. And then the pipe organ that was supposedly last 100 years met its demise during that fire. And it was replaced with electric organ. We lost all of our Christmas ornaments, but fortunately the Superior Church over in Superior donated Christmas ornaments, so we had Christmas ornaments at Christmas. And then the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because this was all burned down, or damaged, that they allowed us to have Sunday school up at their church.
I remember coming to church with blankets.
Uh-huh. So you were here during a baptism, because Mike Sean Hoops had his baptism 2 days after the fire. And Judy wrote me a little note. There was no heat or power, and the church was very cold. Many of the windows were broken or shattered, and the smell of smoke still lingered in the air. Pam Reineman let us go to their parsonage across the street after the baptism because it was so cold.
Do you know what started the fire?
Julie, have you run across anything?
No.
I haven't.
No.
I think it was an electrical problem.
Sub-basement.
Oh, wait, it was a boiler. It, you know, there was a new heating plant
Yeah?
and like a boiler that exploded. Yeah,
Okay.
So
It was
it
with the
part
new
of
utilities.
Part of the new system?
in 1970, yeah.
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
I think the cause, I think the cause of it though was an electrical problem, you know, and it could have been in the heating system, you know, like Julie said.
Okay.
If it was a gas.
Yeah, to me, it was probably something with the new stuff.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
The minute you said sub-basement, everything that's down there is utilities, so it's more than likely electrical.
Yeah.
Even if it's part of the heating system, it would be the electrical part of it.
And I thought this was interesting. It was 1988 that the church got its first computer and copy machine. And we did own, I forgot to mention on that plat book, the corner lot across the street. When we bought this church, it came with a parsonage. And in 1989, Pastor Reineman bought his own home. And so we were able to sell that parsonage. And we sold it for $44,500, which allowed us to pay off another mortgage. So we had another mortgage burning during that time. 1988, going back to Pastor Reinemann's, it was 1975 is when we had our peak membership of 422 members, 586 baptized souls, 130 Sunday school enrollment, 104 in VBS. Some pretty impressive numbers. This was another blessing that we received here at Mount Olive. In 1988, we received almost an $84,000 bequest or funds from Dr. Harold and Mrs. Ray Walder. And then his nephew also did a memorial of $5,000. And apparently they didn't like sitting on the hard wood pews, and so he specified that $5,000 would go to cushions. And I think many of you were involved, and I'll mention those that are here. But we started out with a Congregational Workshop, where we just studied what we needed here for worship, membership, nurture, and finances. And then we did a long-range planning committee, and to get more suggestions and direction as to what direction we should go. And it was determined at that time that we needed more educational space. And Kay, I think you were involved with that committee. On April 10th, 1989, the congregation voted then to designate the Walder bequest for building funds. And then a facilities planning committee was set up, and other goals were created: create more educational space, additional parking, accessibility for the mobility challenged, larger administration offices, and a larger narthex. And Ruth, you were involved with that committee. Then there was a building committee formed from 1991 to 1993, and pledges exceeded what we needed by 1992, thanks to efforts of people like Julie and Ernie were on that committee. And then during that same period, a building committee was pulled together. Julie and myself were on that one. And we had several drafts at the beginning, coming up with trying to incorporate all of those wishes that the congregation had. One of the challenges we had is, if you can see it, we built the addition on, but because the church was facing with the altar here, the entry was coming in by the altar in the front of the church. And we had several meetings trying to work through that, kind of say, well, that's okay, we can make that work. And then one of the people at the meeting who asked to not ever let this out, but I'm going to let it out tonight, came up, and Pastor Reineman asked the question, what if we flipped the sanctuary around? And the rest is history. That's what made it work, was his suggestion. But he personally asked not to let that out. But it's worked so well, I think it's okay to let that out. because of some cost overruns, there were some things that we wanted to do that we weren't able to do. One was a steeple. I believe that we did do the supports in the roof, but we had to take the steeple off, and we're researching that right now. We do have a steeple. There'll be maybe some more discussion on that down the road. There was also a choir loft that was designed, so that you'd have steps going up to a choir loft. That had to be taken out. And then when we tore off the offices and everything, we didn't have the funds to also redo the bathrooms. So we tore everything out except those old bathrooms from 1970. So, and then just built around those. And here comes the issue that we had. We had bought this house, made a parking lot, but we brought the parking lot all the way over to here so you could go and get into the back of the church. Well, when we were tried to get permits, we found out that we didn't own this part of the property, so it would have totally thrown off our parking plans. But fortunately, this house down here had to have some plumbing done, so we allowed plumbing to come across this property in exchange for him letting us buy that. In fact, I think it was just a trade. There wasn't any money.
Is the creek on the lower side of that house?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't know why I thought it was on this side.
So this is the church before the addition and the construction. And I asked Jeff if he had any memories of growing up across the street. And his memory, really the favorite one of his, is that this grass by the church, that was the neighborhood football field. So that was his memory of growing up across the street as a youngster. And another one of the goals of our addition was to preserve the historical integrity of the church. This is what we were trying to preserve. And so John Hellstrom was our architect, and so he actually went around on the addition that we were tearing off, counted all the stones, and then incorporated back into our addition. And not only were we pleased with what happened, but we also were honored by the Duluth Preservation Alliance to the fact that we did maintain the integrity of the church. And if you go up on the left of the elevator, I think that's where the plaque is. That's where the plaque is that they gave us. And the dedication for the addition by Pastor Ryan was in September of 1993. And his comment was, "It came about not because of human wisdom and understanding, but because of the gracious and loving hand of our Lord and God. We humbly fall before him and acknowledge it is because of his mercy and his goodness that we are able to do anything." Does anybody know when women got the vote in the congregation? There's this one little tidbit that I ran across.
When we got the what?
When women were able to vote at voters' meetings at Mount Olive.
October 1973.
Yep. And I also noticed that in 1969, it was brought up, but was tabled. So.
Actually, in 1969, the Synod permitted it for the first time. You know, in convention, they asked the question, and it was permitted that women have the right to vote in congregational activities, but took Mount Olive 4 years to accept that.
Yeah.
It took a long time for the men to get there.
Well, I just found that fascinating that that's when that happened. I thought it happened a lot sooner than that. So here's the completed church. We have had 3 campus pastors here serving both St. Scholastica and UMD, and I'm watching the clock. I'm going to try to be done by 9. Or 8, I guess that is. Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you.
Daylight savings time.
Yeah. The first campus pastor was fully funded by Minnesota North District, and that was Pastor Andrew Demmett. I don't know if any of you remember him being here.
He had laid on Christ the King.
Yes, yep. And even though he was fully funded, he really kind of embraced himself with our congregation. And then he lived also up at Luther House, which is across from Mulaski Field. I think that's St. Marie Street up there. And he was here for 3 years. And then in 1991, Pastor Magruder came as the campus pastor and also as the associate pastor, helping Pastor Reineman. And this was the time when Pastor Magruder came in that we as a congregation committed to subsidize campus ministry. And like Pastor Demmett, Pastor Magruder served for 3 years, and until Pastor Reinemann's retirement, and then that's when Pastor Magruder became our senior pastor. And now we had some concerns about Luther House. Pastor Demmett, Pastor Magruder, they were bachelors. And so we didn't really care what was happening at the Luther House too much. Then we heard that Pastor Frank not only had kids, but he had a wife. And so we thought that we should probably do something. And Bob, do you have many memories of, because you were in charge of fixing Luther House up?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the time, Church Properties Board did a lot of work with it. We did have organized volunteer days for the rest of the congregation to come in. We had contractors do siding and roofing and carpeting, but we did all the painting and that type of thing. So it was a lot of work, but it was worth it. And the Senate paid for it, the district, because they own the house.
Yeah, so that, and that was the first time I realized that I had a chance to work with. That's when I got to know you better, is when we worked up there at Luther House. Pastor Frank served as campus pastor for 11 years, and then he was accepted, when he accepted Mount Olive's call to be our senior pastor in 2006. And since 2006, we set up to where a college student would be taking over the duties under the supervision of Pastor Frank. And today it's the twins, Rachel and Elizabeth, that are filling that position. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the legacy of the women's groups here at Mount Olive. As early as 1923, a ladies' society was formed. In 1941, a women's guild was created to serve those that could not meet during the day. And then in the fall of 1973, two existing LWML groups, the Afternoon Women's Guild and Morning Mission Circle, joined to become the Ladies' Guild of Mount Olive. And there are also 5 circles with various goals of sewing choir robes, lap robes, fellowship for new members, birthday parties for nursing homes, converted fireside room, that's during this period that we got our library. And recently the LWML women are increasing their activities again. There's monthly mites that go to district mission projects, and then the two most memorable would be our senior saints that have happened in the last couple of years, and as well as cookbooks. And the group that probably had the biggest exposure was this group, and the Puppet Ladies. They began making puppets in 1957 for children and pediatric wards. The ages were 57 to 94. They met every Thursday at one of the 2 hospitals to sew puppets. And they had sewed over 20,000 puppets by 1988. And there was a newspaper article that I read, and it's hilarious. From 1988, the interview was in St. Luke's, and this was quoted out of that article. Bunny Berg has stitched puppets longer than any of the current volunteers at 87 years of age. She states, "I work at both hospitals, and I like them about the same." Then Bunny looked up with her fabric with a mischievous gleam in her eye. Then she said, but they give us coffee and rolls at St. Mary's. We don't get that here.